In this unit, we're going to discuss configuring DAC and IPAM. So DAC is dynamic access control, and IPAM is IP address management. Sorry about the typo on the first slide here. That should say IPAM and not PAM. But in any event, so dynamic access control, which we're going to talk about first, deals with more granular control of file access. Now, what's important to note here is prior in the course, if you recall, we talked about classification, file classification services, which allows us to tag files with additional metadata to describe that file. But at the time, I only briefly mentioned DAC, the fact that once we have files classified, I don't mean classified as in like no one's allowed to look at it, but classified as in we've categorized and applied metadata, so we have tagging on that data. Once we know what something is and we have this additional information that describes the file, now we have to think about how can we more granularly control access to those files based on those tags. I'll give you a good example. Let's say, I work in healthcare, so a lot of files in healthcare have patient information on them. So we could use file classification that could identify files that contain private information about patients, patient information, or PII. So personally identifiable information. HIPAA says we have to take, which is, regulation says we have to have special rules about who can access that file and what they can do with that file. So one thing I can do for starters with classification, which we talked about in classification, is I can define what someone's allowed to do with that file based on the classification. So I can create rules that say you can't print the file or you can't email the file and so forth. So the other thing I could do with dynamic access control, not only do I have granularity, this adds the granularity on who's accessing the file, which they call a claim, and we're going to talk about this here in a few minutes. So now, not only do I have more information about the files with 2012 Server if I install the optional classification role, I can also have more information about who's trying to access that file and from where they're trying to access it. So for example, going back to that example of a file that has personal identifiable information, maybe when someone is in the office, it's okay for them to open that file. But if they're connected through a VPN on a mobile device, even though it's the same user account, I don't want them to be able to access those files from outside the building because I want to keep it out, I'm going to keep that information inside my building. So with dynamic access control, I could say when someone's trying to access something that's classified as PII, if they are logged in from a certain type of computer or through a VPN, I can look at that claim to see some attributes about their computer and their user account, and even their job title, right? So in Active Directory, we can, in the schema for Active Directory, we can classify people based on their job title. And I could say the only job titles that are allowed to access that information are the following, right? And I can list what those are. So that's what dynamic access control does for us. Now, it's important to note that dynamic access control is not a replacement for NTFS permissions. NTFS permissions and sharing all works the same way. The problem with NTFS permissions and sharing is that you don't get this level of control. So with NTFS, I could set it up so that a certain group or a certain role does not have access to files broadly. But what I can't do is say if they're on one type of computer, they can access it, but not from another type. That's where the configurability with NTFS ends. So we still need to use NTFS to put in whatever level of control we can use with NTFS, but dynamic access control gives us that next layer of control and also the ability to audit, access, and have a way to centrally manage this access control. So it's just another tool in the toolbox that we can use to enforce our IT security policies. All right, so this is what it looks like when we're configuring dynamic access control. This is the classification tab, which I just talked about. So let's go ahead and talk about this. So building a DAC infrastructure. DAC infrastructure consists of several parts. You have the resource properties, which is an attribute applied to a resource and is used to classify resources. So that's the metadata that we're tagging on the resources that users are trying to access. And then you have file classifications, which are properties to classify data in files and folders. That's that metadata that I've been talking about. A claim type is the property of a user or a computer that's being used in a claim. A claim is basically an attempt to access that file. So claim types are the properties about the person trying to access that file about their computer or about their user account. And then essential access policy is used to configure resource permissions with group policies. And then essential access rule sets permissions on target resources and are deployed through the essential access policies. So here we can see the dynamic access control resource properties dialog, which you'll see in the lab. One of the labs is to set up dynamic access control. So to configure resource properties, to access the resource property list in the ADAC, you're going to click Dynamic Access Control, then you're going to double-click Resource Property Lists, and then the Global Resource Property List defines by default and contains all resource properties. So to classify a file, you're going to open the Files Property dialog box and click the Classification tab, and you're going to click a property in the top pane and click a value in the bottom pane. So if you want to clear an existing value, you're going to click in the bottom pane to remove an existing value. This is what it looks like. So this is how you can classify files. And again, this works with file classification services that we talked about earlier in this course. So a claim is basically someone or something that's accessing the file. So you can configure claims. So you may want to restrict access to certain files based on the user account's department or job title or the type of computer they're using. Any metadata that's available to us in Active Directory but is outside the realm of what we have access to with NTFS, basic NTFS permissions. So to create a claim, you're going to go into the Dynamics Access Control in ADAC. You're going to double-click Claim Types, create a claim type by clicking New in the task pane. And then in the Create Claim Type window, you see a list of AD attributes. You can click an attribute name. For example, you click Department, and then you would click OK. And you can see in here these are some of the attributes that you'll be able to use when you're setting up Dynamic Access Control. And there's many more than just things like department name. So configuring group policy for claims support. So before a domain controller can support claims, resource, and resource properties, a group policy setting has to be configured in GPO and linked to the domain controller's OU. So best practice suggests creating a GPO and linking it to the domain controller's OU. Domain controllers running Windows Server 2012 support claims and resource properties and file and folder permissions conditions. So client computers must also have the claim support enabled. It's important to note that if you don't have claim support in a client computer, it will not use it. So if you have versions of Microsoft Windows in your infrastructure that do not support claims management, then you may have some issues, right? Because it'll bypass, someone could technically bypass these controls by not having an OS with a version that checks that. So client support for DAC is configured in group policy by enabling Kerberos client support for claims, compound authentication, and Kerberos armoring policy. So you have to enable that policy in order for this to work. So the GPO the policy is enabled on must be linked to the domain or to an OU containing the computer accounts from which the user access resources is secured by dynamic access control. And this is the dialog box. This is what it's going to look like when you go to configure that. So if you're going to test DAC, so you're going to create some kind of user account to verify the permissions are enforced on the user logging in from a client computer. Then you're going to create an OU named test DAC and add users to it. So for example, the department tab for the department and job title attributes, you're going to set the value that you're trying to test with. So in this case, you would call it marketing. You would open the advanced security settings dialog box. In effective access tab, you select the accounting one user, and then include a user claim and set department attribute to accounting. So to view the effective access of the marketing folder by the accounting one user, you click View Effective Access button, and then the condition specifies that the user must have the same department attribute as the resource property. So the user's department is accounting, the folder is set to marketing, so it should prevent the user from being able to access it. So accounting one would have no access. And then you could do the same thing for marketing one and executive one users and see if they're able to access the file, which they should be able to. So you can also configure DAC with central access policies. So CAPs enable you to target resources on servers and set dynamic access control permissions with group policy tool. So this can be targeted to specific servers by linking the GPO in which they are defined into an OU containing computer accounts of target servers. So when you're using CAP, NTFS permissions are evaluated first, and then the CAP permissions. So you have to be sure that NTFS permissions are less restrictive than what you set with CAP. Otherwise, NTFS is going to block the access before CAP even gets a chance to try to determine whether the access is permitted. So to deploy CAP, you're going to create one or more central access rules in ADAC, and then you're going to create a central access policy and add one or more central access rules to the policy. Then you're going to deploy the central access policy with the group policy tool. I know this seems like a lot of steps, but this is how you have to set it up. So this is what the dialog box looks like. And here's the dialog box for central access policy, for creating a central access policy. So when you've created all of the rules and added them to the policies, you can deploy CAP with the group policy tool. So you're going to right-click the CAP setting, click Manage Central Access Policies to open the dialog box, and then you're going to add the policies that you want to the GPO. So again, this all works with group policy. So one of the problems with all of this granularity is that sometimes people that need access to files are not going to be able to get access to it, and they're going to want to be able to resolve that. So this you can save a little bit of time and effort here by using access denied assistance. So basically, this will allow when somebody tries to access a file and DAC or CAP restricts their access, it can display a custom error message so that users see a custom access denied message so that they can hit a button to request assistance, which can send a notification via email to a distribution list so that whoever needs to grant access to that file for that user can do so. And in some cases, just as easy as changing their role. For example, maybe somebody says to their employee, you're going to go and access this file to go and do some tasks that I'm giving you to do. The user tries to access it and they get denied. They're not able to access it because they're not the right type of employee. But then maybe the manager can say, oh, all I have to do is go into the HR system and update you from being, accounting rep 1 to accounting rep 2 or whatever it is. And that would automatically flow through Active Directory in the metadata so they can now access that file. So that's kind of how that would work. So you can create these. This is what the message would look like. So the user would get a message that looks like this saying you can't access the file, but you can go talk to somebody about it, or you can click this button to request assistance. They'll fill out a little form and hit the button to explain why they're trying to get access, and then somebody will get back to them and say, hey, we gave you access to that file. You can now access it. So that's it. In the next portion of the course, I am going to, or the next slide deck, I'm going to talk about Internet Address Management, or IPAM.